And if you know where I'm going with this lesson this morning, you'll know that that's a perfect lead-in to the story we're going to be looking at today. I love being in a boat on the water. When I was growing up in Jackson, Mississippi, my dad had a boat, and I know my memory might not serve me best, but it seems like he and I were out on that boat more Fridays and Saturdays than not. And I really enjoyed those times out on the water. Now that I'm an adult, Beverly and I love cruising. We just love going on cruises. Just love being on the water. And I think I've only been seasick once in my life. I don't remember it real well. It was another time when I was with my dad. He was in the Gulf fishing with some friends, and all I remember is I slept most of the day. I just didn't feel like getting up. But I'm going to tell you today with the text we're going to be looking at. In Mark chapter 4, if you want to follow along in your Bibles. Mark, you probably should have warned them as we began today to go ahead and take a Dramamine, because I can tell you that now, but it's not going to kick in before the sermon's over, okay? But this is a sermon that could make you seasick. Mark's action-packed gospel has kind of slowed down a little bit as we looked at the parable stories the last couple of weeks, but now all of a sudden things kick right back into action today. And in fact, we're going to have 4 straight miracles that Mark records, and they are action-packed. So we're in Mark 4 and verse 35, and it begins like this. It says, "That day when evening came." That day suggests it's the same day that Jesus has told these parables. It's been a long day. It's been an exhausting day. I'm not trying to get you to cry for me or anything, but people don't realize unless they're a preacher, preaching takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot out of you, and Jesus has been doing that all day. And in fact, if you look on back in this story, it could be that he did a lot more than just teaching those parables on this day. And it's come to the end of the day, and he's exhausted. And so it says, that day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Beverly and I have been blessed to be in a boat on that lake on 2 different occasions. And it is a life-changing kind of experience. And we're going to, Lord willing, be there again this fall. And I want to invite you to come be with us. Several of you have been there, and you know what it's like to be in a boat on that lake. Storms like the one that's just described are rare on the Sea of Galilee, but they do happen. And in fact, there is a sign on the western side. There's a little beach on the western side of the Sea of Galilee, and there's a car park there on the beach. And there's a sign there that warns people who park their cars that at certain times, if the winds come up, that their cars are in danger of being swamped by the waves. So it's significant the kinds of storms that can occur on that lake. But this story isn't just about the danger of the storm and the deliverance from it, the rescue from it. We really need to know the backstory a little bit. The Jews had a tremendous fear of the sea. You can see that throughout the Old Testament. They were not seafaring people. They left that to their neighbors to the north, the Phoenicians. For Jews, the sea had come to symbolize for them the dark power of evil. And so when Jesus rescued the disciples from a storm at sea, we're witnessing in concrete terms what the parables had said in word pictures. That the kingdom of heaven is breaking into this broken world. That God's sovereign power is being unleashed. That God's kingdom is at hand. The same power that made the world is now residing in Jesus Christ Himself. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel describes a moment where these monsters, these sea creatures, come up out of the sea, and they are put to flight by one that Daniel calls the Son of Man. And now Jesus takes on that term for Himself. He refers to Himself as the Son of Man. And here we see the Son of Man driving out the forces of chaos. These dangerous images that the Jews had of the sea. So let's break this story down a little bit. It says that day when evening came, He said to His disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Now I want you to catch this phrase. Leaving the crowd behind, they took Him along just as He was in the boat. There were also other boats with Him. It's an interesting phrase. They took Him along just as He was. You see, the one that they got in that boat with was the same Jesus that they had come to know. A good teacher, a miracle worker. But they're about to learn a lot more about Him. The Jesus they leave that boat with is not going to be the same Jesus they knew when He got in the boat. He's the same Jesus, but they're going to come to know Him in an entirely different way. They're going to have a radically changed view of who He is. And I want you to also be aware of this. It says that Jesus said, "Let's go to the other side." They're going to the other side of the lake. It's about 6 miles away across that lake. Realize that the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River are a divider between Israel and Gentiles. And Jesus is being called across the lake, called by God because He's going to have an appointment there. We're going to look at that in 2 weeks, Lord willing. So they're leaving the land of the Jews and they're going to the land of the Gentiles. In verse 37, it says, "A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped." Now the Sea of Galilee sits down in a basin that's 700 feet below sea level. And to the north and to the east are the Golan Heights. And in the Golan Heights, to the northeast from the Sea of Galilee, is Mount Hermon, 9,200-foot peak. You can see it off in the distance here. This is a view from on the other side of a city called Tiberias, which sits on the Sea of Galilee. This is where we stay several nights on our trip, is in Tiberias. But you can look across 30 miles away. You can see the snow-topped mountain there, Mount Hermon. Well, the cold winds from Mount Hermon are drawn down into this basin, and they meet the warm winds of the Sea of Galilee that have come across Israel, across the wilderness. And so these warm and cold are drawn down almost with a funnel effect down into this lake. And when that happens, there can be tremendous upheaval of winds and waves up to 6 to 10 feet on the sea. Now imagine you're in a fishing boat like they would have been in, only sits about 2 feet above the water line when you've got 6 to 10 foot waves coming. It can be terrifying. Mark calls this storm a furious squall. It had to have been pretty bad to get this kind of a reaction from His disciples, most of whom had grown up on that lake. They had experienced all of this before, but this is a squall that beats all squalls. And so I want you to picture them. They're bailing water furiously. They're pulling at the oars, trying to keep the boat pointed in the direction of the waves so that they don't get broadsided. They're doing everything they can to keep this boat from being capsized. They're hanging on for dear life. It had to be a terrifying moment for them. At this moment, these fishermen are chickens of the sea. Do you get that? And then amazingly, though, I want you to look what it says in verse 38. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" As that boat tossed and turned, Jesus wasn't. He's at peaceful sleep in the midst of a storm. But the apostles see him sleeping, and they don't attribute him sleeping to his confidence in God. In fact, they interpret his sleeping as that he doesn't care. Now, how ironic is that? The very reason the Son of God, the very reason God in flesh is in that boat to begin with, much less is on this planet called Earth to begin with, is because he cared so much. And their question is, why don't you care? But I have to confess to you, I've been there. So have some of you. One minute the weather's fine. The next minute you find yourself in a terrible storm. Things are fine one minute. The next minute the bottom falls out. All it takes is that one phone call you get. That one 24-hour period. That one visit to the doctor's office. It's the storm of your life. And I've shouted, "God, what's going on? Don't you care? After all, I'm one of yours. Hey, isn't life supposed to be smooth sailing?" We do and say things when we're frightened, when we're scared, when we feel alone that we wouldn't say otherwise. But I can guarantee you this one. It's safe to say that following Jesus doesn't always mean smooth sailing. And so the disciples rebuked Jesus. Now, that started into effect several rebukes in this story because they rebuked Jesus. Now Jesus rebukes the storm. In verse 39, he got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. There's a saying, everybody talks about the weather, but nobody can do anything about it. Well, Jesus talked to the weather, and he did something about it. Normally, when a storm ends, it takes a while for the waves to settle down. But not this time. When Jesus said, "Quiet, be still," the wind stopped, but the waves also stopped, and the lake became completely calm. As still as the Dallas Cowboy offense last year. No ripple at all. And Mark now makes it clear that Jesus is not simply a man of God, but who has some power. He is much more than that. He is power. You see, what you think of Jesus is going to determine what you think of this story. And I happen to believe, along with the Apostle John, who said, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." I believe that. And John said he was in the beginning with God. And I believe that. And he said through him, who's he talking about? Jesus. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And then Paul says this to us. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. And I believe that. For in Him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through Him. Who's Him? Jesus. All things have been created through Him and for Him. I believe that. And He's before all things. And in Him all things hold together. And I believe that. And so when I read this story, I bring all that to it. Jesus made the world. And when Jesus speaks, the creation obeys Him. He is the highest power. No one can control the weather but God Himself. Would you agree? And through this event, Jesus is demonstrating, I'm not merely someone who has some power. I am power. It's interesting that the word Jesus uses here to quiet the storm, when He speaks to the storm, it's the same words in chapter 1 that He spoke to the demons that He cast out of that man. Which has led many scholars, and I tend to think possibly this is true as well, that perhaps Satan saw this as an opportunity to take Jesus out. He's tired, he's exhausted. Hey, you do know Satan, according to the book of Job and other places, Satan can affect the weather. Possibly that's what's happened here. That he's trying to take Jesus out in this one fell swoop. And Jesus uses the same words to rebuke as He used when He cast a demon out of the man in chapter 1. Because you see, regardless of whether that's what happened or not, all storms are a consequence of a sin-broken world. Our world is God's creation, but our world is also a world that's been broken by sin. Sin makes our world a victim. And one who can command a sin-damaged world to obey Him is one who is greater than sin itself. And so the disciples rebuked Jesus. Jesus rebuked the storm. And here comes rebuke number 3. Jesus rebuked the apostles. He said to His disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" I think the Greek is interesting here because it more suggests, but it doesn't flow for us in English, it more suggests that Jesus said something like, "Do you still have not yet faith?" After everything that you've seen, after everything you've heard, has all that taught you nothing? You know, it's not real clear what a person thinks about Jesus here in this room. If you really want to know what people think about Jesus, you're going to find out in a hospital room. You're going to find out at a funeral home. You're going to find out at a graveside. You're going to find out when the pink slip comes. You're going to find out when someone says to you, "I don't love you anymore." That's when we really find out what people think about Jesus. Faith is not so much about a strength or belief that we hold inside ourselves. Faith is trust in something outside of ourselves. It isn't a matter of whether we feel a strong faith. It matters where our faith and trust has been placed. Imagine you're at the edge of a cliff and you slip off, and at the last moment you reach up and you grab hold of a root. It doesn't really matter a whole lot how much faith you have in that root. What matters is if that root is grounded or not, right? If that root can save your life, and Jesus is the root. It's not the quality of our faith that saves us as much as the object of the faith that we have. Paul seems to suggest that in that famous passage in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8 when he says, "For it's by grace you've been saved through faith." And hey, by the way, it's not of yourself. It's the gift of God. So don't miss this in verse 41. They were terrified, and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." That guy who got in the boat, the man that we knew just as he was, who is this? The disciples go from being afraid in the midst of the storm to terrified after it, Mark says. They appear to be more afraid after the storm is calm than they were in the middle of the storm. The Jesus that they took into the boat just as he was has become something entirely different to them now. And they wonder, in whose presence do they find themselves? The psalmist had written in Psalm 46 and said, "Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress." That word "with us" in Hebrew is the word Emmanuel. You add the word El on the end. In Hebrew, El means God. So Emmanuel means God with us. And Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. And the disciples were afraid because they had not recognized who it was among them. Fear hinders faith, but faith dispels fear. Cut them some slack. These disciples are still learning. That's what the word disciple means, learner. They're still learning. They're still fairly early in their journey. Who can rebuke the winds and the waves? The Holy One of Israel is with us. And that creates its own kind of fear. His awesome otherness made them uncomfortable. There's a Latin term for this that you'll come across if you're reading theological works on the subject. The Latin phrase is tremendum fascinans. Tremendum is a word that means a mystery that repels us. Fascinans is a mystery that attracts us. And tremendum fascinans is those moments that we see in Scripture and maybe that you've experienced in your own life, where in the same moment you are being drawn to while at the same time feeling like you need to draw away. The word describes being drawn to the holiness of God while simultaneously being terrified in the presence of God. Luke describes that real well in Peter's reaction to when Jesus had caused them to have this great catch of fish. In Luke chapter 5 and verse 8, it says, when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' feet. You see, his knees. He was drawn to him, and at the same time, what's he say? "Go away from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man." Tremendum fascinans. That's what the apostles, the disciples, are feeling in that boat. This terror they're feeling is this tremendum fascinans. Well, we too are disciples, which means what? We too are learning. Let's not be too critical of the disciples because we're on a similar journey. Winds and storms come our way too, and we often live in fear when they besiege us. And learning to live in faith means that we continue to learn. Let's not heap guilt on ourselves if we haven't arrived yet, but as we go through storms, we continue to learn that we don't need to fear the storms because we continue to learn that we can put our trust in Jesus Christ. The power of evil was broken at the cross and at the empty tomb. But just as often happens in wars and in sporting events, the losing team is kind of upset and they don't want to give up. And so they continue to wreak havoc on people. And we as Christians are continuing to have havoc wreaked upon us by the brokenness of this world and by the forces of darkness. And so yes, we Christians are going to get hurt. And yes, some of us are going to be killed. But Jesus commands and calms the storm. Jesus embodies the peace, the shalom of God. So even though the storms pound against us, we confess in faith, we will not fear. But getting to that point takes some time to learn as disciples, just like it took the 12 some time to learn. And so in this story, Mark is inviting us. He's saying, okay, go ahead. Wake Jesus up and pray to him about your fear and pray to him about your anger. But then don't be too surprised if after the storm subsides, Jesus turns to you and says, do you still have a not yet faith? Mark's first readers, 30, 40 years after Jesus' resurrection, Mark's first readers would have easily identified with these frightened disciples in this boat because they were living in a storm. They were living in a world where daily they were facing life and death decisions about Jesus. And this story reminded them, and it should remind us today, that peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is not the absence of turmoil. Peace is not the absence of storms in your life. Peace is the presence of Jesus Christ. Emmanuel, God with us. And we're going to sing a song right now that speaks to that. If you need to respond in any way to an invitation to come and be united with Jesus in baptism, to bring prayer requests, or go to room 102 to meet with an elder and his wife, this would be an appropriate time for you to do that, and we would rejoice with you in whatever decision you make as we stand together and sing.